In this video, we're going to look at how to find the right API for your Bubble app. A lot of things can be natively built on Bubble, but one of the best parts about the platform is that you can connect it to the outside world. There are many cases where you may want to integrate data from third-party sources or functionality from special services into your app. And you can do all of this through APIs. An example of this would be if your app is built to connect service providers with customers, so a traditional marketplace structure. But you need to use a third-party service in order to process payments between those users. So a payment API is going to be at the center of those transactions. And there are many options out there that offer this kind of capability. The problem is figuring out which service to use, whether it's even compatible with Bubble or not, and what to do from there can be a little confusing, which is why I'm going to help you break down what you need to know and what you need to look for to get started. It's not as intimidating as it may initially seem. My name is Gabby over at Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom applications for business, whether it is an existing business or something brand new, and they're doing this all without code. So let's get right into it. When we talk about connecting a Bubble application to another service, a third-party platform via API, what we're really doing is programmatically communicating data. Or programmatically communicating functions. So from the Bubble application, you can retrieve data from another service, or you can trigger things to happen in another service. So an example is a marketplace system. There's lots of opportunity there for working with APIs, very common. So let's say that your Bubble application is where your users come on to search for other users, get connected. Maybe they're service providers and potential customers, maybe more of like a ride sharing type of application. And your app is to support that, right? You have the custom search functionality, the profiles, the reviews, you have dashboards for them to keep track of all the analytics. But then there are still key functionalities that are best hosted on outside services, such as the mechanism for processing transactions. So your Bubble application can be connected to Stripe in order to create invoices, to create subscriptions, right? All of that is happening securely on the Stripe end of things. But your Bubble app may need to retrieve information about those payments to display back to the users. And of course, your users want to be able to trigger those things from the Bubble app, as opposed to having to be redirected and, work within multiple applications. They're just in one place only. Your Bubble app can also be connected to a product management solution if you don't want to manage that in your app. So something like WooCommerce or Shopify, right, to get connected to a big library of listings, SKUs, all of those things. Now, these are, of course, optional. It just depends on what you're doing in your application. Another example is connecting to an accounting software like QuickBooks or Xero, so that all of the transaction and financial data can be passed over to the accounting side of the business, and that way users can do their taxes properly and so on. And what we're doing here is really communicating data between the Bubble application and potentially any other services that need that information as well, or are going to be able to support your core functions in your app. Now, what exactly is an API anyway? You're typically going to see this abbreviated, but in case you were wondering, it stands for Application Programming Interface. And all this really is a way for applications to communicate with each other. They're going to communicate data and events. So one service can request data from another service, right? For example, your Bubble application can request all of the customers that are in your Stripe account, for example. Or it can communicate events, okay? So when something happens, you can be notified about it, or you can make a request to trigger something to happen. So again, from your Bubble application, you can make a request to create a new Stripe subscription, or you can be notified whenever a credit card fails on a subscription, right? This communication of data and things happening on either end of the connection is really what the API is all about. It's to allow that line of communication to happen between the two sides. Now, there are varying levels of access and capabilities for an API. You may find APIs that are publicly available, anyone can really work with them, or they may be more protected. You may need to create an account with a third-party service and sometimes even pay to get access to the API. Some APIs are read-only, where it's really just acting as a data source, so you're just retrieving information. In other cases, there is more to do within the API where you can create resources, you can edit things, delete things. It really just depends on what the service offers. Now, in order to get started with finding the right API for your Bubble app, the very first thing you need to do is just to see what the options are. What is even available? So if you've identified a service or a platform that you're interested in connecting to, the first thing you want to do is go to their website. There is typically going to be a section for developer resources. You may see the labeling as API documentation or API reference or just developers. Usually this is found in the footer of the website. Some services may highlight their API more if they're more known for it. And so you may find it actually at the top of the screen on their first, their home page. But that's the first thing, because that's going to give you the gateway for what kind of access is available, the pricing around all of this, and what their API even is capable of doing. Some services that are really large and have many different products may offer multiple APIs, one for each of their products. You'll see this with Amazon, Google, QuickBooks, and other larger companies. In some cases, the API you might want to connect to is a simple tool, right? So the tool itself is the API, and there's no other larger website or account that you need to create in order to get to it. We're going to take a look at a few examples so I can show you what I mean here. But yeah, there are some standalone services that all they do is offer an API and nothing more. What you want to make sure is that the type of API that is being offered is a REST API. This is specifically for web-based applications. These are web-friendly APIs. There are actually other types of APIs that are going to be much more code-based. So what you're looking for are REST APIs. And to be honest, these are the most common. After you've identified the documentation for the REST API within the service you want to connect to, the next thing you want to check are the authentication requirements. This could potentially be a major roadblock for you. If you can't get access to the API, then you just can't use it. So the authentication is the very next thing that you want to check. So when you get to the point of configuring this in your Bubble app, you're going to make a request for every single interaction, whether it's a request for data from the third-party service or a request to trigger an action, trigger an event of some sort. Typically, you need to authorize these requests. There's a lot of APIs that are free and open, but most of the time you'll need to have some sort of really a password or an identifier so that that third party knows that you are allowed to make this request. API keys, access tokens, OAuth 2, basic authentication, if you're given what's called a client ID or a secret, all of these things are compatible with Bubble's API connector tool, which is the plugin that you'll be using to configure all of your requests. Now, I'm going to run through a handful of different examples here with various third-party services to show you the kinds of things that you want to be looking for when you're trying to confirm whether the API is right for you. So let's start with Stripe, really popular payment gateway. We use it all the time with our clients in their applications. It supports just about any payment model. This is what you want to do. Go to their website and look for their developers section. So Stripe actually has this at the top of their page because Stripe is very API friendly. They're very developer focused, and they've built out their entire API system to be as easy to integrate as possible. So it's very front and center. You're not always going to find this at the top of the page, but for Stripe, we happen to have this here. Okay, so there's the developers, and you can see there's a number of guides and resources. The full API reference is something that's going to be the dictionary for following when you configure your calls. Moving over to the next example, QuickBooks. So this website doesn't have the developer section at the top. So normally what you want to do is go all the way to the bottom. Let's actually pull the scroll bar here to their footer and look for the developer section. Over here, it is under partners. And then we have here for developers. So they have a whole other section of their website that is specifically for working with integrating with the QuickBooks APIs. And QuickBooks actually has multiple APIs because they have various products, right? So there's a whole other section here that we can get to, documentations, getting started guides, all of this. Next example, Shopify, really popular for e-commerce. If I go to the resources menu, we're not going to find the developer section there. I just want to show you what this looks like because this is typically the first place that I would go to look, right? So I'm looking around here for developers, API. I'm not seeing any of that. So the next place I'm going to go to again is the footer, which is typically where most of these links are going to live. Here we go. They have a whole section for developers, right? Your documentation. This is probably kind of an overview of what the API offers, getting started guides, things like that. Now, the next example that I have here is more of a tool, right? So I mentioned this where some APIs are simply offerings of a whole platform, right? A whole service that you can use standalone. It's not always going to be integrated somewhere. Whereas this type of service here is actually the API. There's nothing else going on here. When you're using this, you are here to use their API. So that is very much front and center. In fact, their call to action here is to get started for free with an API key. That way you can get right into it. Of course, they're going to have a place to get to the documentation so you understand how to formulate the requests. But this is something it's a much smaller platform because all it is it's just the API. Now, I actually have another exchange rate. I don't think I mentioned that, right? This is a tool to help you get real-time exchange rate information. So I have another exchange rate API open here. This is a different service. And the reason I have them both is to show you the difference in pricing. So that is definitely something that you'll want to be mindful of. Well, with all of these, there's going to be somewhere in their documentation that goes over the pricing options for getting access to it. Some cases, they may be included with your general account with the service. In other cases, they may be add-ons, or they may be completely separate accounts that you need to create to access that. So if we look at this first exchange rates API and head over to their pricing page, I want you to see the difference in the range of how much access to an API could cost. So for this one, they've got a free plan. You get a limited number of requests per month, right? Then their next plan, $10 a month. You get more requests monthly. Okay, so you can see kind of things just bump up from there depending on the number of requests you need. Whereas with this service, we're going to go to their exchange rates API, head over to their pricing plans to take a look at the numbers. So you do get a 7-day free trial, and their first plan starts at $425 a month. That is a huge jump. And I imagine that's because this is a much more comprehensive API. It may be a difference in their data sources or other features that come along with the API that the first service just doesn't offer. So do your research, right? Do your homework and understand what it is you're getting, what it is you need, and what's within your budget. Because different services could just completely be out of the question based on how much they are, or they can be something that you grow into. You could potentially switch from one to another depending on where you're at in your application's journey. The next example here is another tool. This API is much more tool focused as opposed to being a complete platform where it's standalone. This is to convert files. Really any kind of file of any format, multimedia, documents, things like that, images. While you can do the conversion directly on this website, this has really been built for you to do these conversions programmatically via API. So you integrate with this so that your application can be the front-end interface in the database for having users upload their files, click on a button to trigger the conversion in the background. We're really having this service do it. And then this service would return the result, right? It would return the converted file. So anyway, they have, all of their API documentation front and center because that's really the main event of this service. And of course, their pricing as well. The next example here is another tool, which is to create PDF documents. You provide it with a web URL and it will generate a PDF out of it. So again, there is a tool here to do this directly on the website, but the main event is really to do this programmatically. They expect you to integrate this into an application. And so they have all sorts of documentation around what you get. They incentivize you to get started with a trial. You get a demo license key so you can play around with it for a little bit until you actually need to start paying for it to do more conversions. So I'm going to scroll down here a little bit. Actually, let me go to the pricing for this API so you can take a look at their model is, a certain number, a certain amount per month, and that includes a certain number of conversions. So in some cases, these APIs are going to be priced just a standard subscription-based system, or they may be more of a quota-based system. So how much data that you're working with, how many runs of some action you need it to do. or it could be like a per user thing. It really just depends. So just make sure you understand what the pricing is looking like there. Another thing that I want to take a look at real quick here in each of these services is the authentication system. I mentioned that that's another thing that you want to confirm. How do you get access or are authorized to make requests? So let's take a look at Stripe, going back to their developers, and we're going to go to their full API reference here. This is, again, like the dictionary of every single possible capability within the API. Notice that the authentication is one of the very first things that we see in the menu here, and that's typical. You'll usually find it in the very first pages of the getting started guides, because without authentication, you can't do anything else. So we can see very clearly here, Stripe is a REST API, very compatible with standard web APIs, very compatible with Bubble. And when I go over to authentication, Stripe tells me immediately that they use API keys. Okay, so again, API keys, access tokens, OAuth 2, basic authentication. If you see mentions of client IDs and client secrets, that's all compatible with Bubble. Jumping over into QuickBooks, let's take a look at their documentations. I'm going to head over to their getting started. I don't see an obvious resource here for authentication, so I imagine within their getting started guides, we'll have a way to learn that. So let's take a look. This is what I wanted to find, right? There's a whole set of sub-resources specifically around authorizing access to the API. So it looks like they work with OAuth 2. OAuth 2 is very standard. It's essentially a way for you to get access to user-specific accounts. So if you're building a financial dashboard for your users and they each have their own QuickBooks account, that's what would make sense here, right? They need to authorize your Bubble app to access their QuickBooks account on their behalf, right? So you can get to their data specifically, not just one kind of master QuickBooks account. All right, so here's a recap on the key areas that you need to be mindful of when you're choosing an API to integrate with your Bubble application. First, what kind of access requirements are there? Do you have that access? Do you need to create an account? Do you need to pay for an account? Second, what's the cost? If you need to subscribe to a plan in order to access the API, what does that look like? Or do they bill you based on quotas and usage of the API? Make sure you understand the pricing model around access to the API and figure out if it's in budget or not. Third, what can the API actually do? Does it have all of the capabilities that you need to integrate with? You may be surprised, but there are actually some APIs that don't offer full functionality or full access to all of the data of the service itself. So imagine, this is not the case, but imagine QuickBooks didn't give you access to invoices and only customers, okay? That's not actually the case with QuickBooks, but that's just kind of a quick example. There are some services where not every corner of their platform is actually accessible through the API. So make sure that what you want to do, the stuff that you want to get connected to, is actually available in the API. And you can find that in the documentation. And finally, code. Are there any requests that require some level of working with custom code like JavaScript or custom encryptions that need to be added to those requests? Most cases, you won't need to work with custom code like this, but we have come across APIs, especially ones where there are visual elements associated, so like video players or charts, where communicating the visual aspects with the API, right? These visual aspects are, would ideally be embedded in your application. They often require some code to communicate. Most APIs, though, that you're using in your app, they're not going to be tied to a special visual element. They're just going to be things that you trigger from your own designs in your Bubble application, or just pulling in data sources, right? So you can use all of your same buttons and repeating groups and, visual elements, images, things like that. Just be very mindful. Check the documentation to see if, a specific request actually requires you to go through any kind of custom code to make it happen. Because if so, you may need to get connected with a developer who can help you with those pieces. Again, most of the time you won't be running into this. To get started with integrating an API into your Bubble application, first thing, just check to see what's available. Choose the one that's right for you. Make sure it's a REST API that meets your needs. Second, create an account in that third-party service to get access to the API. This often means it'll generate an API key for you or an access token, right? Go through the steps to get the proper authorization, and then head over into your Bubble editor and install the API connector. This is a free plugin. It's a Bubble plugin, and this is the tool that you will be using to configure your API requests. Bubble's API connector actually comes with a number of different presets to handle all of the popular forms of authentication, which is really nice. It saves you a lot of time, and it also does more of the heavy lifting for you. Of course, you can also do authorization in a custom way. If you know what you're doing, you have manual control over that as well. And then from there, you're going to be following the documentation for the third-party service in order to configure and initialize your API calls. Once they're initialized, you'll be able to use them either as workflow actions or as data sources in your app. And from there, you're connected. Now, the very next step I want you to take is to head over to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop to join our free extended training workshop on how to build a no-code app as a non-technical entrepreneur. That's over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, and we can't wait to see you there.